Welcome to Backstory with Joan Goldstein. I'm Joan Goldstein. I have a very, very interesting guest today. His name is Steve Yacik.
That's correct. We're off to a good start.
And he was referred to me by the Princeton Historical Society, for which he is a tour guide. Steve has been working in many areas and looking at Princeton and leading discussions. And right now, he and I are going to focus on the story of J. Robert Oppenheimer, the scientist who did at one time live and work in Princeton, as well as develop what was then referred to as the atomic bomb. Steve, tell us about yourself. How did you decide that that was something you wanted to share?
Well, I had volunteered in my restless, I'll say, early days of retirement. I decided that I would channel my passion, my interest, my need for additional learning towards learning more about the history of a local community for me, but one that I really didn't know that much about, namely Princeton, New Jersey. I live in Middlesex Borough, which is about 45 minutes away, and prompted by a tour that my wife and younger daughter and I took a few years ago, that spawned an interest in the notion of, hey, maybe I could do that. I love to learn about the history of the US generally, and Princeton is certainly an appropriate channel to learn that much more about our history, both from the Continental era, the Revolutionary War era, all the way up into the present day. So I raised my hand via the Historical Society website and signed up to be a tour guide. I started doing that in November of 2021. And then after leading Sunday tours, which are about 90 minutes around various parts of the campus and town, I then offered to do create a new tour in conjunction with Halloween of last year around the spirits of Princeton. And then that in turn included a component dealing with Oppenheimer and the Manhattan Project, which then led to the creation of this current tour in conjunction with the release of the movie. So yeah, go ahead, Joan.
Well, there's been so much talk and show in newspaper articles and television and movies about Oppenheimer at this particular time. Why is it so current now?
It's always current, right? If you think about everything from the situation in Eastern Europe that pervades the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. What's the right thing to do? There's always that looming threat of someone in a moment of anger, in a moment of lack of control, now having the ability to release nuclear weapons. And there's this phrase that goes around called tactical nuclear weapons. I'm always puzzled about, well, what does exactly that mean, right? What's a tactical nuclear weapon when you're dealing with something that with the push of a button and within seconds can destroy the lives of millions of people, not just those who die immediately, but those who survive. So what's tactical about that? Anyway, so it's current now. The notion of how important is information security within our government, within our nation. There's always more and more to learn. And that among the things that I find interesting about the movie and the story more generally is it raises a lot of questions, but it doesn't give simplistic, pat answers to those very difficult questions. But at least it raises our consciousness, our focus if even for a brief time, on this central question of 21st century America and 21st century planet Earth.
Yes. What happened? Why are we celebrating it at this particular time, if celebration is the correct word? Maybe acknowledging is a better word.
Right.
But at this particular time, isn't there an anniversary?
Well, there's every August 6th and 9th are the anniversaries of the dropping of the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. July is the anniversary of the test at Alamogordo, the Trinity test, which becomes one of the central points of focus in the movie. So yeah, there's an annual anniversary, and 1945 will be approaching soon the 80th anniversary of those two or three events.
It's a long time, and yet it's something we mustn't allow ourselves to forget.
No, if I've seen the movie twice so far, and I've come away with a number of different things. Once at the Princeton Garden Theater, where else?
You did too.
Yeah, and I know that the focus on this theme will be temporary. It will be fleeting. Something else will very quickly call for us to repivot our focus and our attention other than on this story. But one of the things coming into this interview that I was mindful of is that I think Christopher Nolan, the director, and really the genius behind this movie, would say, it's not about a movie. Don't think that this is a movie that once you leave the theater, wow, that was a good movie, let's go have lunch. It's the movie is the story is much larger than the movie itself. The movie helps us to learn, helps us to raise questions in our own mind, but the real story is the fact that 9 countries across the globe have the ability to launch nuclear weapons with devastation, not just to whoever their intended target was, but to countless others.
Yes, that's quite an amazing figure. Can you mention some of those countries?
Let's see if I can test myself. Let's see: the U.S., the UK,
Yes.
France, Russia,
Yes.
China, Israel, Pakistan, India, and I'm missing one more. Anyway, it'll come to me. But there is one country I'll mention who was the 10th country, who then turned in their arms. They took down their nuclear arms, and that country is South Africa.
Oh, yes.
North Korea. Duh, North Korea, of course.
Yes.
Great country. Maybe in descending order of stability.
Yeah, so this is a modern story, and why should we be interested? Why should children be interested? Why should anyone be interested?
Well, it's kind of we tend to ignore it, myself included, until the tours and the movie and so forth renewed and deepened my focus on it. But it's something like, you think back to, oh yeah, the Cold War, and advising children to hide under their desks at schools, and sirens once a week going off in towns, air raid sirens. When I was a kid, I used to watch the reruns of the old Twilight Zone series, and pretty much every other episode was something about a nuclear event. Those days, in one sense, from our consciousness until recently, have passed. We just kind of gloss over it, but it's not past, and that's why it's worth learning more and more about. There's so many facets of this story that deserve additional scrutiny.
Can you give us some examples of things that need to be looked at that are not being looked at?
Sure. So, well, in one sense, it's unfortunate, I would say, but understandable that both the book and the movie give heightened focus to the security clearance hearings and the way that pseudo legal procedure was conducted, and how it, there's a deep sense of injustice as in terms of how Robert Oppenheimer lost his renewal for security clearance. But I think so much of the story, the positive story, is actually the success of that scientific undertaking. It was the most expensive, complicated scientific project up until its time. And it involved, although I'll say predominantly an American initiative, it involved people from all over the world. Lots of people who came from Eastern Europe, who had a Jewish heritage, and left Central Europe to come to the United States, to places like Princeton, and then ultimately to places like Los Alamos, in fear that Nazi Germany was going to develop this weapon of mass destruction first. And if in the hands of someone like an Adolf Hitler, what was our defense? So every day, the team that worked in New Mexico, in Hanford, Washington, in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, in Chicago, those people knew that they knew people who were seeing the stories about the battles and the role that they could play in shortening the war. And they worked long hours, many days, knowing that their sacrifice might help reduce the number of casualties on both sides.
What about the sites in Princeton? Why are there sites in Princeton that are related to Oppenheimer?
So the tour actually starts at the Princeton Garden Theater, where you said you saw the movie and where I did as well. And I have to say, as a representative of the Historical Society of Princeton, we partnered with the Garden Theater very early on, months and months ago. And they have been so gracious and kind and generous. We've had, when I did a test tour a few weeks ago, there was a representative from the Garden Theater who came with her young child. So we started the Garden Theater for a couple of reasons. One is the fact that it's the Christopher Nolan movie that is the impetus behind the tours and the focus. So where else would be more appropriate than the Princeton Garden Theater? But we also end the tour at the Princeton Garden Theater because there is a story that was quoted by Abraham Peiss in his biography of Oppenheimer, and Peiss was a resident of Princeton as well, and a faculty member at the Institute for Advanced Study, where he talks about how Oppenheimer was somehow perceived as being this emotionless, stoical scientist. When Peiss went to the Garden Theater showing of Jean Renoir's classic anti-war film, The Grand Illusion, in the theater, in the back row of the Princeton Garden Theater, happened to be Robert and Kitty Oppenheimer. And he could see at the end of the film, Robert wiping tears from his eyes because of the poignancy of what the film portrayed, as well as what the opportunity lost, if you will, as I would perceive it. So we start at the theater, we end at the theater, but again, as I mentioned before, the Manhattan Project story is not a movie. It's reality. So that's one thing. And then we also go to we briefly visit the Princeton Chapel, where the director and writer Christopher Nolan visited Princeton, was invited by the class of 2015 to give the class day talk. And in those days, in 2015, Christopher Nolan's big renown was the Dark Knight series about Batman. And he gives a really great talk. You can find it on YouTube easily enough. He gives a talk that says to the class of the class of 2015, and to us indeed, to not chase our dreams, our fantasies, but to chase our realities. Take a look at the real world around us and think carefully about what can I do as a Princeton graduate, as a citizen of the world, to have a positive impact.
Yes, wasn't Oppenheimer also the director of the Institute for Advanced Studies?
That's correct. Yes.
That's what brought him to Princeton, isn't it?
Yes, it is. So I'll interject one more thing. When Oppenheimer became the director of the lead for the Manhattan Project, at least from a scientific standpoint, he needed to recruit capable scientists who knew this relatively new area of study. And Princeton was among the places where he knew there were those capable minds. There was a Robert Wilson, there was a Richard Feynman. It's said that 75% of the physics department at Princeton was assigned to the Manhattan Project because the brain power, that knowledge was here. But going back to your previous comment, yes, after the war was over, Robert Oppenheimer, the Manhattan Project ends, and Robert Oppenheimer explores a few different possibilities. At first, he thinks he's going to go back to California to teach there. But then ultimately, and interestingly, he is invited by Louis Strauss, a trustee of the Institute for Advanced Study. He's invited to fill an upcoming vacancy as the director of the Institute for Advanced Study. And Oppenheimer, as he says in the movie, he says, well, it sounds like a great opportunity. I'll give it some thought.
Wasn't Albert Einstein also there at the same time?
Albert Einstein was there. Albert Einstein came to Princeton and the Institute in 1933, in part because of his Jewish background, because of the rise of the Nazis in his native lands, and fear for his life, his possessions. His sailboat, his apartment was raided, and so forth. And Einstein, yes, comes to Princeton to, I'll say, find some sanctuary, find a place where he can do his work independently, also not have to worry about teaching underclassmen about physics, but he can work peacefully and do what he can, picking up the line from Christopher Nolan, what he can do to improve the real world. Yeah, I'll add to that. He's contacted by some of the physicists that he knew back in Europe, who want to approach President Roosevelt and say, with this successful splitting of the atom, we're mindful of the fact that the Nazis may be able to develop a bomb, and our only defense will be to get there first. But they need a name signature on the bottom of the letter that they've drafted, and they approach Einstein, and he reviews it. They collaborate on the final draft. It's given to Roosevelt, and shortly thereafter, the Manhattan Project emerges.
I have a memory of Einstein. I was a founding member of a research group of women at the time in the Princeton Research Forum. And we used to meet for lunch at the Institute and have our meetings there. And I used to go early so I could take a walk outdoors on the trails. As I'm walking outdoor one day, I see a gentleman with a lot of white hair. I came in and I described it to someone. They said, "You saw Einstein."
Sure.
So I
Yeah.
actually saw him walking, and I was walking, and it was a very amazing experience.
Sure.
Yeah.
And he apparently he was kind of like, I guess every small town has people like this that you see walking around, but he became I mean, obviously he's Albert Einstein, right? He's a world-renowned figure. And just as you said, visually, there's nobody else who looks like Einstein, right? But it seemed like the town of Princeton kind of adopted him as, you know, the happy, somewhat eccentric uncle, right? So children would come to his house for Halloween to get, you know, and he was always there at the ready. Where there would be, you know, I don't know whether it's urban legend or not, but there would be stories about, you know, Albert crossing Nassau Street or whatever, and car drivers would know, well, it's Albert, so maybe he'll fully cross the street, maybe he won't, but give him some space. But yeah, no, he was recognized as a really a kind, gentle, humble person. So yes, so he was already at the Institute and stayed at the Institute, living on Mercer Street for the next until 1955, until his death.
Steve Yacik, this has been a wonderful discussion. You are so knowledgeable. You've given so much thought to what you're looking into, and you share that for the Princeton, is it the Princeton Research, Historical Research,
Yeah.
excuse me. And I think it's so nice that you also came on board my show, because I really wanted to talk about Oppenheimer, and I wanted to talk about that part of our lives. And you shared so much with us. So thank you so much, Steve Yacik. And if people want to take your tours, what do? Do they contact the Princeton Historical Society?
Yes, they can go to the website, and princetonhistory.org. And among the first things that they'll see is a walking tour calendar. There's a nominal cost associated with the tours, but they're offered frequently, and from time to time through Eve Mandel, who I mentioned before, we can customize tours for corporate groups or particular area of focus. So for example, tomorrow, or actually this Friday, I'm doing a tour for a corporate group. All of 20-something-year-old IT people from France. So orienting that talk for that audience is something that we can accommodate.
Well, Steve Yacik, thank you so much for coming on board that Backstory with Joan Goldstein. I wish you the best for all of the good work that you're doing. I'd like to join one of your tours, so please make sure I get a chance.
We'd be happy to have you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming to Backstory with Joan Goldstein.
You're welcome.